Hi everyone, and welcome back to Bowdie Shorts, making law make sense in 15 minutes or less. So far in this contract law series, we spent a lot of time looking at how contracts are formed, what they contain, what happens when they are breached, and what remedies are available. Today we're asking a slightly different question. When does a contract actually come to an end? Now, at first sight, the answer seems obvious. Surely a contract ends when somebody breaks it. But contract law is actually much more complicated than that. Sometimes a breach ends a contract, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes an unexpected event ends a contract, sometimes the contract ends because the parties have performed exactly what they promised. And sometimes almost complete performance is actually good enough. So let's work through it. So whenever you see a termination problem, ask yourself, has the contract actually come to an end? Because the answer determines whether the parties still owe future obligations to each other. So let's start with the most obvious situation. A contract is broken. Can the innocent party walk away? Well, the answer is sometimes. Not every breach allows termination. So thinking back to when we looked at contract terms, you have to remember that terms can be classified as conditions, warranties, or innominate terms. And that classification matters enormously at this stage. So where a condition is breached, you have to remember that a condition is an important term. If a condition is breached, the innocent party is entitled to damages and termination. And the breach is considered sufficiently serious to justify ending the future performance of the contract. Now, does the contract end automatically? No. And this is a common student mistake. The breach itself does not automatically terminate the contract. Instead, the innocent party has a choice. The innocent party can either affirm the contract or terminate the contract. Now, affirmation means, I know you've breached the contract, but I want the contract to continue. The innocent party keeps the agreement alive and usually claims damages in relation to the breach instead. Now, once a contract has been affirmed, you cannot change your mind later. Now, affirmation and termination are therefore alternative choices. Now let's move on to look at warranties. So a warranty is a less important term. If a warranty is breached, damages are available, but termination is not. The contract continues. Now we get to that middle category, those innominate terms. And the courts realised that some terms could be breached in either a trivial or a catastrophic way. So instead of classifying them in advance, the courts ask, how serious was the breach? So the question becomes, has the breach deprived the innocent party of substantially the whole benefit of the contract? If the answer is yes, termination may be justified. If no, the remedy is normally damages only. Now, there is a next part that we need to consider, which is known as repudiatory breaches. And for SQE purposes, breach of a condition and a sufficiently serious breach of a non-innominate term are often grouped together under this concept of repudiatory breaches. All this means is breaches that are so serious that termination becomes available. Now, what does termination do? Well, termination only affects future obligations, and this is crucial. Rights that have already accrued generally survive. So the contract stops operating going forward. It does not pretend the contract never existed. Now we move to a completely different way of a contract to end, and that is the concept of frustration. And students often confuse frustration and breach, and the two are very different. With frustration, nobody is at fault. Instead, something unexpected happens after the contract is formed. That event makes performance impossible or radically different. So the big question to ask is, has an unforeseen event fundamentally change the contract? If yes, frustration may apply. Now, common examples of frustration would include destruction of the subject matter. So imagine the contract is about a painting, and the painting is destroyed. Once it's destroyed, there is no painting to pass over, the contract would be frustrated. Serious illness where a particular individual is essential. Illegality, so the contract's made and then the law changes, meaning that that particular act cannot be performed without breaking the law. Other elements of government intervention or failure of a fundamental event to occur. So suppose you hire a hall for a specified event. Before the event takes place, the hall burns down. Nobody is at fault. Performance has become impossible. The contract is frustrated. Now, the courts are reluctant to find frustration where performance has merely become more expensive, more difficult, or less profitable. So business risk does not usually amount to frustration. But what about delay? Well, delay creates difficulties. Sometimes delay frustrates a contract. Often it does not. And what the courts look at are things like the length of the delay, the purpose of the contract, and whether performance would become fundamentally different. The longer and more significant the interruption, the stronger the argument for frustration. Let's move on to the concept of force majeure. So most commercial contracts include force majeure clauses. These clauses identify what happens if exceptional events occur. Once the parties have expressly dealt with the risk, the doctrine of frustration often becomes unnecessary. The contract itself then provides the answer. We then need to look at self-induced frustration, which brings us to another important rule. The frustrating event must not be caused by the party seeking to rely upon it. You cannot create your own problem and then claim frustration. The event must be truly outside of your control. So when frustration occurs, the contract automatically ends. Unlike termination for breach, there is no election. So you can't choose. There's not an element of decision to be made. There is no choice. The contract is discharged by simple operation of law. Now, what happens to money that's already been paid? Well, this is where the legislation steps in. The law allows courts to deal with money already paid, money due, expenses incurred, and benefits already received, with the objective being fairness. The courts try to avoid one party receiving an unfair windfall. Now let's consider the happiest way a contract can end: performance. The parties simply do what they promised, the contract is completed, everyone goes home happy. For complete performance, the traditional rule is strict. Contractual obligations must generally be performed precisely and exactly, and this is known as the doctrine of complete performance. Now, why does this cause problems? Well, because real life often isn't perfect. Life is messy. Sometimes work is almost complete. Sometimes a tiny defect remains. Sometimes only part of the contract has been performed. And a strict rule could therefore produce very unfair outcomes. So the law developed exceptions. The first exception is divisible obligations. So suppose a contract is divided into stages, and each stage carries its own payment. Once a stage is complete, payment becomes due for that stage. The contractor doesn't need to complete the entire project before recovering money. Then we've got substantial performance, which is another important exception. So suppose the work is finished, but slightly defective. The contractor has largely done what was promised. In those circumstances, payment may be recovered less the cost of putting matters right. And this prevents the customer receiving almost complete performance for free. Wrongful prevention. What if the employer stops the contractor completing the work? Well, then the contractor may still recover payment or damages. A party cannot prevent completion and then complain that completion never occurred. Finally, if one party freely accepts partial performance, the law may require payment for the value received. And the key word here is voluntary. We're looking at voluntary acceptance of part performance. And then the recipient must genuinely have had a choice at that particular point. So let's bring this all together. Contracts can end in different ways because of a serious breach, because of frustration, and because they have been performed. And the legal consequences are very different. That's why identifying the correct route is so important. So what's Bowdie's bottom line? Well, every termination problem starts with one question. Why is this contract coming to an end? If there has been a repudiatory breach, the innocent party chooses whether to affirm or to terminate. If an unforeseen event makes performance impossible or radically different, the contract may be frustrated. If the parties perform their obligations, the contract ends through performance. And remember, not every breach ends a contract, not every difficulty frustrates a contract, and sometimes near enough really is good enough. Understanding which type of termination applies is often the key to solving the entire problem. Thank you as always for watching this episode of Bowdie Shorts. Please do watch further videos available via the YouTube channel.